Since time immemorial, plants and fungi have proven to be one of Homo sapiens' greatest resources, not just as sustenance, but as a fount of healing medicine, spiritual inspiration, and mystery. Humans do not merely utilize these species for these purposes, but are intrinsically involved in the cultural knowledge surrounding them, their domestication, and safekeeping. Imagine a world without painkillers, antibiotics, anticoagulants, anti-malarial medicines, or some chemotherapies, all of which have been either directly derived from, synthesized, or inspired by plants and fungi. And who would want to live in a world without the mystery and magic of poison-tipped arrows or hallucinogens? In Plants of the Gods podcast, renowned ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin, who has worked in and on the Amazon for almost 4 decades studying the relationship between humans and plants, takes his listeners on an inspiring journey from the most remote corners of Amazonia to other exotic locales. Learn about the fascinating history and uses of the plants of knowledge and power, like the hallucinogenic snuffs of the Yanomamo tribe, to coca, from which cocaine is derived, the ayahuasca liana, from which a hallucinogenic brew is produced, or the diverse formulations of curare, a plant mixture which relaxes the muscles of the body and leads to asphyxiation. Not only will you better understand what we know about these sacred species and how we use them, but how they are revolutionizing Western medicine while the fight is on to protect these healing species and the people who know them best. This and more from Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.
Today's episode is on ergot, LSD, and the origin of Western religions. Let me start out by talking about my favorite fungus, a fungus known as cordyceps. Cordyceps lives quiescent on the forest floor and waits for insects and arachnids to go past. Once it's done that, the fungus attacks the insect exoskeleton, boring a hole in the insect exoskeleton, thereby allowing it to insert itself inside the insect body. Once it does that, it proceeds to devour virtually all of the insect's non-vital organs. Once it's done that, it invades the insect brain, causing the insect to climb to the top of the tallest tree in the forest. Once the insect has done that, it eats the rest of the insect brain, thereby causing the insect exoskeleton to split open, thereby allowing the fungus to release its spores 120 feet above the forest floor. And this is why ethnobotanists don't read science fiction. We believe that Mother Nature is infinitely more fascinating and perverse than anything that a science fiction writer can devise. But again, there is an angle to this which involves health and healing, because this particular fungus in the 1970s was found to contain a substance called cyclosporin A. Now, this is about the time that people began trying to transplant organs from one body into another. The first organ transplant, heart transplant, a fellow by the name of Barney Clark in South Africa, I believe it was, had the heart rejected by his immune system. What could be more invasive to your immune system than have somebody else's heart stuck into your chest? But through the use of cyclosporin A, which is an immunosuppressant, physicians were able to suppress the immune system and allow these organ transplants to take place safely and effectively. These days, organ transplant is an everyday affair, but it never would have been possible without these fungi. Another one of my favorite fungi is that of the genus Penicillium. Now, I often play a trick on the students when I'm teaching. I ask the students, what is the first gift from the Penicillium fungus to the human species? And the hands go up and they say penicillium. And the answer is wrong. The first gift from the Penicillium fungus to the human species is blue cheese. The blue in blue cheese is a Penicillium fungus. The second gift, as we all know, is indeed penicillin, the drug that changed the world. In fact, I believe this is the most important class of drugs ever discovered from the natural world, and I'll talk more about that in a later episode. But few people realize there's a third great gift from the Penicillium fungus, and that is statins. Statins are cholesterol-lowering drugs, first brought online in the 90s and worth billions of dollars. I have never, ever met a physician even one who was prescribing statins that knew that this came from the fungal world. Now, from a global perspective, fungi comprise the least studied group of organism with the greatest healing potential. Fungi have already gifted us with antibiotics, and not just penicillin, but many antibiotics. Immunostimulants and statins are both billion-dollar classes that have resulted from the study of fungi. Ethnobotanists in the Amazon, where I work, actually in the western Amazon in Peru, west of where I work, have often encountered something called piri, a strange-looking sedge reputed to have many medicinal qualities. Now, sedges are flowering plants that are kind of innocuous and don't have much interesting chemistry, so it's long been a riddle why these were seen as very powerful medicines. However, detailed research by my colleague, ethnobotanist Glenn Shepard, found that the medicinal qualities attributed to this chemically inert flowering plant are actually due to an ergot-like fungus that infects it. Lab research has revealed that this fungus in the Amazon produces 8 novel alkaloids related to LSD and are employed by indigenous peoples to treat everything from headaches, snakebite wounds, staunch birth-related hemorrhaging, and control fertility. It produces a variety of curative effects, and Shepard considers it sort of a, quote, ginseng of the Amazon because of its multifaceted panacea-like medicinal uses. Now, the relative of that Amazonian fungus that I want to talk about is ergot. Ergot is primarily a European fungus. It's a parasitic fungus that infects cereal grains, primarily rye. Alkaloids in ergot can constrict blood vessels, which is why they're known as vasoconstrictors, and can cause seizures, nausea, gangrene, hallucinations, uterine contractions, and death. Therefore, midwives, who are often the best herbalists, often employed ergot to induce abortions and as an aid in childbirth. Today, the purified alkaloid ergometrine, remember that ergot has 12 alkaloids that we know of, it's used medicinally to reduce postpartum bleeding. Another alkaloid, known as ergotamine, is an effective treatment in many cases for migraines. Once again, this is one of those plants of the gods that can kill or can cure. Now, ergot has been called by medical historians, physicians, and pharmacologists a gold mine, a treasure chest, and a Pandora's box, which reflects the fact that it's so chemically powerful, so chemically potent, and on occasion so chemically lethal. It can infect other grains like wheat and barley and oats, but rye is what it is most commonly known to attack, and this led to major effects in European history. Interestingly enough, if you look at it from an ethnobotanical perspective, rye was primarily the food grain of the Teutonic regions. Wheat and some of the more other well-known cereals were grown in places to the west, France and England, and it was only later as rye began to spread to other parts of Europe that you have the so-called ergotism taking place, infecting the cereal grains and causing terrible and excruciating death. So one form was gangrenous ergotism, in which case the affected body parts, typically toes or legs, would turn black with a dry gangrene that either necessitated amputation of the limbs or the limbs would just drop off on their own. In the case of convulsive ergotism, it began with an itching, a prickling under the skin, numbness, cramps, spasms, sometimes ending up in hallucinations and convulsions. And so characteristic was this prickling under the skin, or the feeling of ants running around under the skin, there was devised a technical term for this, formication. F-O-R-M-I-C-A-T-I-O-N. We would also describe this sensation as pins and needles. Now, these epidemics were particularly common, of course, where rye was most common. And as I said, rye was particularly the grain of choice in the Teutonic countries, like Germany, but it eventually spread east into Russia and west all the way as far as England. There are many epidemics recorded in France, and the condition that it caused was known as sacred fire because it caused a burning sensation in the limbs and the extremities. It was associated with St. Anthony, who was thought to have power over fire. Levitin, who did a very thoughtful and insightful book on economic botany, points out that the historical impact of ergotism is something which is often underestimated in many histories, and that's been a point in this whole podcast, how we can better understand some aspects of history which typically are not very well explained in the history book because they don't understand fungi or plants. Levitin wrote that in 1727, Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, was halted in his ambitions to invade Turkey and capture a warm water port when both his soldiers and the horses developed ergotism after eating contaminated bread and grain in the Volga Valley. Some historians have in fact attributed the witchcraft in Salem in the 17th century as being due to ergotism. There are many theories written by historians. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly what went on, but our understanding of what happened there certainly fits the pattern of hallucinations. Ergotism is particularly common in a certain set of meteorological conditions, and in this case, at this period in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was perfect for the growth of ergot. Rye was grown in the colony at that time, and the wet winter followed by the dry season were believed to be very conducive to the growth of ergot infecting the rye crop. The people who testified at the Salem Witch Trials thought they were bewitched because they had muscle pain, spasms, tingling limbs, convulsions, and other symptoms that are consistent with ergotism, such as hallucinations and visions. The end result of this is that people were in fact hung for witchcraft. So this isn't something that is to be sneered at, and this is something worthy of further investigation in trying to understand the impact of the plants of the gods on human culture.
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
Now, the name of this podcast series is Plants of the Gods, and I chose that name in homage to Richard Schultes and Albert Hoffman. I've talked quite a bit about Professor Schultes, the great Harvard ethnobotanist, but Albert Hoffman, in some ways, was more famous. He was a Swiss chemist who in 1938 was studying ergot alkaloids. He decided to create a new compound from these alkaloids, in other words, a semi-synthetic compound. Scientists sometimes take a natural product and then tweak the molecule, add a side chain to make it more effective, less poisonous, what have you. And he decided to create a compound similar to choramine, which was a central nervous system stimulant. On a historical note, choramine was often used to treat tranquilizer overdoses. In fact, Adolf Hitler in his bunker in 1945 was being plied with tranquilizers as the Russians closed in, and then the physicians would ply him with choramine to try and reverse their effects. So they were reversing the effects of these tranquilizer overdoses. Hoffman in 1938 created LSD, according to John Menn, a famous chemist and medical historian, because it bore a structural similarity to choramine. So Hoffman decided to experiment with his new creation by taking it, which is a very ethnobotanical thing to do. He wrote, quote, "I sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors." End of quote. Now, Hoffman thought this was such a wonderful and positive experience. Maybe I should take more. So he then took 0.25 milligrams of LSD, and the results were quite different. Hoffman again, I quote, "Everything in my field of vision wavered and was distorted. Pieces of furniture assumed grotesque, threatening forms. The lady next door was no longer Mrs. R, but rather a malevolent, insidious witch with a colored mask. A demon had invaded me, had taken possession of my body, mind, and soul. I jumped up and screamed, trying to free myself from him, but then sank down again and lay helpless on the sofa. I was seized by a dreadful fear of going insane." Once again, the point being that dosage and setting are key components in how these extraordinary substances affect the human mind. And as we know, one of the great stories in Western medicine these days is the mainstream of these plants of the gods or fungi of the gods. But again, in doing it in a Western setting, we're able to control the setting and the dosage and make it much more safe. Now, I've never had a problem taking any of these substances with shamans in the traditional cultural setting, and that is because they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing in terms of dosage. They're knowing what they're doing in terms of setting. They know what to do in case things take a turn for the worse. So once again, I emphasize that none of these substances we've been talking about are to be trifled with. Now, a most extraordinary occurrence in the history of these compounds took place in 1941 when my mentor Schultes identified ololiuki, one of the magical plants used by the Aztecs, first identified in the Aztec codices. It talked about the plants and fungi they used that led to the discovery of Teonanacatl, the flesh of the gods, which we now know as a mushroom, and will be covered in a future podcast. Identified ololiuki as Turbina corymbosa, which is a morning glory. Now, this is interesting for two major reasons. Number one, because this was a similar compound in a flowering plant that had first been identified in fungi, and that it was found in a family, the morning glory family, which really wasn't known to be very chemically active. So once again, listening to the ancients, once again, listening to indigenous peoples, led to a really rather extraordinary finding. No news to the indigenous peoples who knew and used it for healing and divination, but a major surprise to Western scientists. Now, Schultes, as an ethnobotanist, believe in taking the stuff yourself. So amongst the Mazatecs in Mexico, he decided to consume ololiuki in a ceremonial context. He learned that the indigenous peoples took 13 seeds, which were taken in water or alcoholic beverages. It was always consumed at night and typically administered in a very quiet place. The effects were said to last for about 3 hours, followed by a feeling of discomfort and negativity. In fact, in a very obscure paper, Schultes described the ceremony and how it felt. Quote, "The intoxication begins shortly after the ingestion of ololiuki. It rapidly proceeds to a stage where visual hallucinations appear. However, there is often an intervening stage of dizziness or giddiness, followed by a feeling of general ease and well-being, lassitude, and then increasing drowsiness. Usually, the drowsiness develops into a stupor or a kind of somnambulistic narcosis. During the stupor, the patient is dimly aware of what is going on about him and is susceptible to suggestions. The visions which occur during the somnambulistic stage of the intoxication are described by the indigenous peoples as very similar to those which are said to be induced by peyote and by the magic mushrooms. They are often grotesque visions which portray people or thoughts or happenings that have occupied the patient's mind during the preceding hours. It is partly by means of these hallucinations and partly by means of the indistinct and delirious talking which accompanies the narcosis that the medicine man practices divination." So this is part of the process of cleaning out the mental attic, as the shamans would say, going in places where you have stress or the traumas and getting rid of them. Now, Schulte said, I published this paper on Ololiuki in the Harvard Botanical Museum leaflets in 1941. It was read by very few people until the year 1967. All of a sudden, they couldn't keep morning glory seeds on the shelf in Berkeley, California. People were buying them in droves. Of course, you have to keep in mind that people in Berkeley, California can hallucinate on distilled water. Now, I don't want to give the impression that ergot was solely a negative substance when it came to its influence on human civilization. I gave the example of the fact that it's used to treat migraines. It's used for some childbirth issues still. But there is a much more intriguing aspect to the history of our species in a relationship with this fungus and the compounds it contained. I've mentioned Gordon Wasson. Gordon Wasson was a banker who read Schulte's paper on the hallucinogenic mushrooms of Mexico and went down there and helped launch the whole revolution and interest in these entheogenic substances. Wasson went on to work with Albert Hoffman to think about and investigate the possible involvement of ergot alkaloids in certain religious ceremonies in ancient Greece. And the most intriguing of these was the Ellusinian mysteries, where people, as even well known today as Sophocles and Plato and the poet Pindar, underwent this ceremony, and it changed them forever. Many of the people who experienced the Ellusinian mysteries and wrote about it said it was the most important experience in their life. There's a carving in ancient Greece that refers to what it's like to undergo the Ellusinian mysteries. Quote, "Death is for mortals no longer an evil but a blessing," referring to the initiates who had undergone the mysteries. Hoffman and Wasson went on to collaborate with a classic scholar named Carl Ruck to create a book called The Road to Eleusis, which attempted to solve the mystery of the Ellusinian mysteries. And their hypothesis is that the Ellusinian mysteries consisted of the consumption of a wine spiked with what appeared to be barley infected by ergot, which would account for the mysterious aspects, the mystical aspects, the otherworldly aspects that the people experienced through the course of this ceremony or ceremonies. It's also believed that this, in some way, was a hallucinogenic retelling of the myth of Persephone and Hades. Remember that Persephone was the queen of the dead who was seduced down to the underworld by Hades himself and then ate several pomegranate seeds, meaning that she had to spend several months of the year in Hades. Now, this was seen as an allegory between the seasons. That is, winter, things are dead, things are dying, and spring, when Persephone emerges from the underworld, life is reborn. So the Ellusinian mysteries, through the use and magic of ergot, became a symbolic renaissance where the worshippers believed that the restoration of Persephone, the restoration of the goddess to the upper world, the world of the living, was, in a sense, a resurrection. Now, this is covered in great detail in a fabulous new book called The Immortality Key. And the Immortality Key delves further into this mystery of the Ellusinian mystery, builds on the work of Ruck and Wasson and Hoffman, with the added advantage of new technologies and new excavations that seem to support these theories. Furthermore, in so doing, the author, Brian Murarescu, makes a link between these ancient Greek mysteries and the origins of Christianity. So in the original publication, Ruck and Hoffman and Wasson postulated that the kykeon, which is what they called the sacrament used in the Ellusinian mysteries, was psychoactive, and that the visionary experience that all the initiates underwent was due to the infection of this ergot fungus, which is in some ways similar to visions unleashed by the consumption of LSD. But Morarescu took this further by looking for early evidence that early Christianity involved visionary plants and fungi as well. And he cites two extraordinary cases. One is a villa found outside Pompeii, a minor villa excavated not too long ago, that was obviously a center of manufacture, which included in the preparations they were manufacturing opium and cannabis, indicating that the ancient world was quite cognizant of these plants and was undoubtedly using them for a variety of purposes. Furthermore, he cites evidence of an early Christian goblet, I think it was 4th century, which was full of mind-altering substances as well. So what he then asks in the course of this book, which I highly recommend, was whether the Eucharist was psychoactive, which would have been in keeping with other ancient traditions, and was the wine drunk in the original Last Supper with Christ spiked with visionary plants. So in that sense, finding the Holy Grail would indeed be the Holy Grail. The important part here is that we think of Christianity growing out of some of the early traditions of Judaism, which I think is unquestionably the case. But what Morarescu does in his book is point out that early Christianity may actually have had roots in Greek rituals using mind-altering plants as well. And I think the case is pretty convincing. Recent excavations in the Holy Land have found Jewish altars where cannabis had been burned. So I don't think that this was a mainstay of much of ancient Judaism, but clearly psychoactive plants were involved. Now, a famous Israeli ethnobotanist, after taking ayahuasca, started thinking about many of the experiences recounted in the Bible and other early accounts of early Judaism, and said, burning bush, speaking with God, sounds like psychoactive plants may have had a role. He said, well, there's no ayahuasca in the Sinai Desert. But here's something interesting. The first analysis of ayahuasca found an alkaloid. And in ayahuasca ceremonies, one is able to communicate telepathically with a shaman. That is characteristic of a real traditional ayahuasca ceremony with a real traditional shaman. And in honor of this effect, this alkaloid was named telepathine. However, research found that the alkaloid had actually been found years earlier and christened harmaline, or harmine. And when a chemical is given a name, but it's found to have an earlier name, the earlier name precedes it and is basically the one that's considered correct. So harmine, harmaline. It was given this name because it was found in the Syrian rue. Syrian rue grows in the Sinai Desert. But, said the Israeli ethnobotanist, alkaloids have to come from two plants to make a real ayahuasca brew. So he went back to the Sinai Desert and he found the other alkaloid in acacias. Acacia is very common in the Sinai Desert. And not only are both plants and both alkaloids found in the Sinai Desert, but the Lost Ark of the Covenant is made of two things. The Lost Ark of the Covenant, made famous in the Spielberg film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, was made from two substances, gold and acacia wood. So yes, there may have been psychoactive plants and psychoactive fungi involved in the origin of both these religions. Now, this is not meant to be disrespectful to anyone. This is just positing a hypothesis which I find very intriguing. And when you think of the mystical experiences which are at the root of almost all the world's religions, whether you're in the Amazon or whether you're in the Sinai, it's interesting to think that maybe these plants of the gods played a fundamental role. As an ethnobotanist working in the Amazon, I've spent decades hearing about the origins of a certain people, a certain culture, a certain tree have to do with mystical experiences, with the great cosmic canoe coming down from the sky, with the sacred ayahuasca plant. And if you're not used to hearing this type of thing, it can seem rather odd. But let's remember that one of the origin stories of Western religion is the Garden of Eden, where the snake is chasing Adam and Eve through with a mouthful of apple. Now, I've eaten plenty of apples, did not find them imbuing me with any wisdom, but I've eaten many of these plants of the gods, smoked them, snorted them, fungi of the gods, and I have to say that I learned a lot more from these substances than I did from any apple I've ever eaten. The point here being that sometimes there's a commonality to the origin of cultures and religions which we shouldn't overlook. Food for thought.
This has been Plants of the Gods, Healing, Culture, and Conservation with Dr. Mark Plotkin. Stay tuned for more stories about shamans, hallucinogens, entheogens, unique religious and cultural histories, and rainforest adventures and cures. If you enjoyed this episode, please recommend us to your friends and rate and review on iTunes. To learn more about the mystery and splendor of the Amazon rainforest, find Dr. Plotkin's latest book, The Amazon: What Everyone Needs to Know, on Amazon.com or your local bookstore.
If you have any questions about today's episode, direct message us on our Twitter or Instagram at Doc Mark Plotkin or Facebook Plants of the Gods Pod, and the questions will be answered by me. Follow our Facebook page for more information, or check the Amazon Conservation Team webpage, www.amazonteam.org, for more information on our field programs. Excited to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in.